Thomas Brennan had learned to sleep through artillery fire, but he could not sleep through silence. The apartment on Rue de Rivoli was quiet in the early hours of March 1944, the kind of quiet that made his hands shake as he reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. 5 years ago, he had been a school teacher in Lyon, reading Baudelaire to bored 16-year-olds and taking his lunch by the Seine. Then the war came, and he learned what a man could become when the world demanded it. He had fought in the north. He had seen friends disappear into the mud of Dunkirk. He had killed men whose faces he could still recall with perfect clarity, especially at moments like this when sleep eluded him and the darkness pressed close. After the armistice, after the occupation, after everything fractured, he had found his way into the resistance. Not out of ideology, Thomas had never been political, but because remaining still had become impossible. Now in the spring of 1944, with liberation whispered about in coded messages and hopeful glances, he worked as a liaison. Messages passed through his hands. Safe houses were arranged. He did not carry a rifle anymore, but his war had never really ended. Marie was awake beside him. She always seemed to know when the darkness was too heavy. "You should try to rest," she said softly, her hand finding his in the dim light filtering through the blackout curtains. Her voice carried the faint accent of Provence, warm even in whisper. "I was thinking about Sophie," he said. Their daughter was 6 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and his gray eyes. She slept in the next room, curled around a stuffed rabbit that had lost one ear to enthusiastic affection. Thomas thought about the world she was growing up in, where sirens were lullabies and ration cards were ordinary. "She asked me yesterday why the soldiers wear different uniforms," Marie said. "I told her it was like different teams in a game." "What did she say?" "She asked which team was winning." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He sat up, the bed springs creaking in the quiet. Through the thin walls, he could hear the building settling, the distant sound of a truck on the street below. Paris was never truly silent, even in occupation. There were always boots on cobblestones, always the sense of something vast and terrible breathing just beyond the walls. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what Laurent suggested." Marie was quiet for a moment. Laurent was Thomas's contact, a man who had lost his own family in a bombing in Rouen. He had mentioned a village in the countryside, 2 hours south by train and then by cart. A place called Saint-Tomber, tucked into the hills of Burgundy, far from strategic targets, far from the main roads. A place where children still played in the streets and where the war was something that happened elsewhere to other people. "You think we should go?" Marie asked. "I think you and Sophie should go, just for a while, just until," he stopped because he did not know how to finish that sentence. "Until what? Until liberation, until the war ended, until the world made sense again." "And you?" "I have work here the network depends on." "Thomas," she said his name like a complete sentence, with all the weight of 5 years of war compressed into 2 syllables. "You're always the one who has to stay. This is different, the occupation is fracturing. When the Allies come, and they will come, Paris will become a battlefield. I need to know you're both safe." In the morning, Sophie ate her breakfast porridge without complaint, though Thomas knew she hated the gritty texture of wartime oats. She wore a blue dress that Marie had sewn from an old curtain, and her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon. She looked so small at the kitchen table, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor. "Papa," she said, "are we going on an adventure?" Thomas knelt beside her chair so their eyes were level. He had learned not to lie to her. The war had made children older than their years, and Sophie was clever enough to see through false comfort. "Your mother is taking you somewhere safe," he said. "A village in the countryside where you can play outside without worrying about the sirens." "Will you come too?" "Not yet, but I'll visit as soon as I can. And when this is all over, we'll all come back home together." Sophie studied his face with that unsettling directness that children possessed. Then she wrapped her arms around his neck, and he held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, trying to memorize the weight of her small body against his chest. Marie had packed 2 suitcases, small enough to carry, containing only essentials. A change of clothes, Sophie's rabbit, a photograph of the 3 of them taken before the war, when Thomas had still been a teacher and the future had seemed knowable. At the Gare de Lyon, the platform was crowded with people fleeing the city. Thomas saw the same calculation in every face, the risk of staying versus the uncertainty of leaving. German soldiers patrolled the station with casual menace, checking papers, watching the crowds with eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. Thomas walked with Marie and Sophie to the platform carrying both suitcases. He had forged travel permits for them, one of the many useful skills he had acquired during the occupation. The documents identified them as Marie and Sophie Mercier visiting family in the South. Simple, unmemorable. When the train arrived, belching steam and coal smoke, Sophie pressed her face against Thomas's coat. "I don't want to go without you," she said, her voice muffled. He crouched down again, taking her small hands in his. "Do you remember the story I told you, about the brave girl who protected the village from the wolf?" Sophie nodded. "You're that brave girl, and your mother is the wisest woman in the kingdom. You're going to take care of each other, and I'm going to take care of things here, and before you know it, we'll all be together again." Marie's eyes were bright with tears she refused to shed. She kissed him, and he tasted salt and goodbye. "Come to us as soon as you can," she whispered. "I will, I promise." He watched them board the train, Sophie's hand in her mother's, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. They found seats by a window, and Sophie pressed her palm against the glass. Thomas stood on the platform as the train began to move, watching them disappear into the distance, smoke and steam obscuring his view until there was nothing left but the empty tracks and the knowledge that he had sent away the only things in the world that mattered. That night, alone in the apartment, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a glass of cheap wine and the photograph of his family. In it, Sophie was 3 years old, laughing at something beyond the frame. Marie was smiling with her whole face, the way she used to before the war taught everyone to measure their joy in careful portions. And Thomas, in the photograph, he looked like someone who still believed the future would be better than the past. He wondered if that man still existed somewhere beneath the scar tissue of 5 years of war. Saint-Omer was the kind of village that appeared on no military maps and existed in the collective memory of its inhabitants like a shared dream. It nested in a fold of hills where the morning mist clung to the ground until midday, and where the church bell marked time in a rhythm that had not changed in 300 years. Marie and Sophie arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. The cart that brought them from the train station rattled over dirt roads, past fields where farmers still worked the land with horses, past stone walls older than nations. The driver, an old man named Gaston with hands like tree roots, spoke little but pointed out landmarks as though he were describing the features of an old friend's face. "That's the Morrow farm," he said, nodding toward a cluster of buildings. "And there, up on the hill, that's the old monastery, been empty since before my father's time." The village itself was small, perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a central square where a fountain trickled water into a stone basin. There was a church, a bakery, a small school, and a handful of shops that opened according to the whims and energies of their proprietors. The house Laurent had arranged was at the edge of the village, a 2-story stone cottage with blue shutters and a garden that had gone to wild. Madame Beaumont, who owned the property, was a widow in her 60s with sharp eyes and a softer heart than she liked to admit. She showed Marie and Sophie the rooms, modest but clean, with thick walls that kept out the cold and windows that looked onto the hills. "You'll be safe here," she said, and Marie believed her. The days in Saint-Omer had a different texture than the days in Paris. Sophie woke to birdsong instead of sirens. She helped Marie tend the garden, learning the names of herbs and vegetables. In the afternoons, she played with other children in the square, their games loud and innocent in the way that only children far from war could manage. Marie wrote letters to Thomas, though she knew they might never reach him. She wrote about Sophie's laughter, about the way the light looked on the hills at sunset, about the ordinary miracles of a place where war was still an abstraction. She did not write about the anxiety that woke her in the night, or about how she sometimes stood at the window watching the road for a figure that never appeared. The villagers were kind but cautious. They understood that these were times when questions were dangerous, and so they asked none. Marie became simply Madame Mercier from Paris, and Sophie was the little girl who fed breadcrumbs to the ducks by the fountain. But even here, even in this pocket of suspended peace, the war found ways to intrude. German patrols passed through Saint-Omer occasionally, a reminder that occupation was not confined to cities. They never stayed long. The village had nothing of strategic value, no factories, no railways, no reason to warrant more than cursory attention. But their presence was enough to tighten jaws and close shutters, to remind everyone that safety was conditional and temporary. One evening in late April, as Marie prepared dinner, Sophie asked the question that had been building for weeks. "When is Papa coming?" Marie stirred the pot on the stove, watching steam rise and dissolve. Soon, she said, the lie tasting bitter, he's finishing his work in Paris. Does he miss us? Every day, every minute. Sophie was quiet for a moment then. Madame Beaumont told me that her husband went to war and never came home. Will Papa come home? Marie set down the spoon and knelt beside her daughter. She took Sophie's face in her hands, those small features that were so much like Thomas's, and tried to find words that were both truthful and bearable. Your father is very careful, she said, and very brave, and he loves us more than anything in the world. That's what will bring him back to us. But even as she said it, Marie felt the cold finger of doubt trace her spine. The village had its rhythms, and Marie learned to move within them. She helped at the bakery in the mornings, her hands learning the feel of dough, the way flour settled like snow on the wooden counter. She joined the other women for afternoon coffee, ersatz of course, nothing was real anymore, and listened to their stories of sons and husbands who had gone to war or who had stayed and wished they hadn't. There was a beauty to Saint-Tomber that Marie tried to hold on to. The way Sophie ran through the fields with the other children, her laughter carried on the wind. The way the church bell marked evening, calling no one in particular, simply asserting its right to measure time. The way Madame Beaumont left fresh eggs on their doorstep without comment, a kindness that required no acknowledgement. But beneath the beauty, Marie felt something else. A tension, a wrongness she could not name. It was in the way the men in the village sometimes gathered in tight clusters, their voices low and urgent. It was in the sudden silence that would fall when she entered a room. It was in the way Gaston, the cart driver, had looked at her the previous week when she asked about the roads south, a look of warning, of knowledge he would not share. In early May, Father Clement, the village priest, came to visit. He was a thin man with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly, whether from age or fear Marie could not tell. Madame Mercier, he said, accepting the tea she offered, I wanted to ask after your well-being, and your daughters. We're managing, Marie said. Everyone has been very kind. Father Clement nodded, but his eyes were troubled. These are difficult times, the war. It changes course like a river, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. Marie set down her cup. What are you trying to tell me, Father? Only that the world is shifting, and that places which seemed safe yesterday may not be safe tomorrow. I would urge you to be prepared, to pay attention. You've heard something. I've heard many things, rumors mostly, but in times like these, even rumors carry weight. He stood, his tea barely touched. There are places in the hills, caves, the old monastery has cellars, should you ever need, should circumstances ever require it. After he left, Marie stood at the window, watching the afternoon light turn gold across the fields. Sophie was in the garden, talking to the flowers in the nonsense language of childhood games. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked safe. But Father Clement's warning echoed in her mind like a church bell ringing in an empty sanctuary. That night, Marie dreamed of fires. Thomas received the message on a Tuesday morning in June. A courier, a boy of perhaps 15 with eyes too old for his face, delivered a folded paper that contained 3 words in Lawrence's handwriting, Saint-Tomber. Come immediately. He was on a train by noons. The journey south was a study in contrasts. Paris receding behind him, all stone and occupation, giving way to countryside that seemed to exist in a different war or perhaps in no war at all. But Thomas knew better. He had learned that nowhere was untouched, that peace was always provisional, that safety was a story people told themselves to survive another day. Laurent had been cryptic, which meant trouble. Thomas tried not to think about what specifically might have happened. He tried to focus on the rhythm of the train, on the landscape passing outside the window, on anything except the cold certainty growing in his chest that something had gone terribly wrong. He arrived at the station in the afternoon. There was no cart waiting. In fact, the station seemed deserted except for an old woman sitting on a bench feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons. Excuse me, Thomas said, is there someone who drives to Saint-Tomber? The woman looked at him with eyes milky with cataracts. Not anymore, she said. What do you mean? You haven't heard, she scattered more breadcrumbs. Best if you walk, it's not far, follow the road north. Thomas felt his stomach drop, but he kept his voice steady. What happened? The old woman just shook her head and turned back to her pigeons. He walked. The road to Saint-Tomber wound through hills that were green with late spring growth. Wildflowers bloomed in the ditches, poppies, cornflowers, the bright defiant colors of life continuing regardless of human catastrophe. The afternoon sun was warm on his shoulders, and birds sang in the trees, and everything was wrong. He smelled the smoke before he saw the village. It was old smoke, days old, the acrid scent of burned wood and other things he did not want to identify. Thomas began to run, his courier bag slapping against his hip, his breath coming hard. The first body was in the road. An old man face down in the dirt, one hand outstretched as if reaching for something. Thomas recognized the posture. He had seen it before in the north during the early days. The posture of someone running from something inevitable. He forced himself to move past, forced his legs to keep carrying him forward even as his mind screamed at him to stop, to turn back, to be anywhere but here. St. Tomber came into view. Or what remained of it. The village was ruins. The buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened stone and collapsed timber. The church tower still stood, but its roof was gone, leaving only a skeletal finger pointing at an indifferent sky. The fountain in the square was choked with ash. The smell was overwhelming, burnt wood, burnt cloth, burnt flesh. Thomas walked into the square like a man walking through a nightmare. His vision seemed to narrow and expand in pulses. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some in the street, some in doorways, some clearly having tried to run and failed. He recognized faces: Gaston, the cart driver, his tree root hands now curled and blackened. Madame Beaumont collapsed beside what had been her shop, her sharp eyes closed forever. The silence was absolute, no bird sang here, no wind stirred the ash. Thomas's mind was making calculations he did not want it to make. This had not been an accident, this had not been collateral damage from passing conflict. This had been deliberate, this had been punishment. The cottage with blue shutters was at the edge of the village. Thomas moved toward it with footsteps that felt disconnected from his body. Each step was both too fast and too slow. Each step brought him closer to knowledge he could not bear. The cottage was burned, the blue shutters were gone. The door hung from one hinge, opening onto darkness. Thomas stopped at the threshold. His hand on the doorframe was shaking. He could not remember the last time his hands had shaken like this, not in Dunkirk, not in any of the ambushes or close calls or moments when death had breathed down his neck. Only now, standing at this doorway, did his hands betray him. He made himself enter. The interior was charred and collapsed, furniture reduced to ash, walls blackened, the smell was unbearable. Thomas pulled his collar over his nose and mouth, breathing through cloth, and began to search. He found them in what had been the bedrooms. Marie and Sophie had died together. They were holding each other. The fire had taken everything else, but it had not taken that. They had held each other at the end. Thomas made a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a sob, something primitive and broken that came from a place deeper than language. He fell to his knees beside them, and he reached out with hands that were still shaking, and he touched what remained of his wife's hand. The world disappeared. There was no village, no war, no France, no Germany, no occupation. There was only this room and this moment and this unbearable truth. Time passed, how much Thomas could not say. The light through the burned roof changed from afternoon gold to evening red. Shadows lengthened. And Thomas knelt beside the bodies of his family and felt something inside him that had been human begin to calcify into something else. He had learned to kill during the war. He had killed out of necessity, out of survival, out of duty. But he had never killed out of hate. He had never killed because something inside him demanded blood as recompense for blood. Now, kneeling in the ashes of his life, Thomas felt that hate ignite. It burned hotter than any fire. It consumed the man he had been, the teacher, the father, the husband, and left something different in its place. He stood, his legs were unsteady, but they held him. He walked out of the cottage and back into the ruined square. The sun was setting, painting the destruction in shades of red and gold, and Thomas stood in the center of the devastation and tried to understand how the world could continue when everything had ended. A sound drew his attention, movement at the edge of the square. Laurent emerged from behind a collapsed wall. He looked aged, gaunt, his clothes covered in ash. When he saw Thomas, his face crumpled. "I'm sorry," Laurent said. "Thomas, I'm so sorry. I sent word as soon as I could, but..." "What happened?" Thomas's voice sounded strange to his own ears. Flat, empty. "Reprisal 3 days ago. A unit of SS passed through and found the village helping a resistance cell move through the area. They decided to make an example." Laurent's voice broke. They herded everyone into the church, and then they— No, Thomas's voice cut through the explanation like a blade. Don't tell me what they did, tell me who did it. Lawrence stared at him. Thomas, I understand what you're feeling, but— Tell me who did it. An SS unit, Captain Heinrich Vogel's company. They're stationed 30 kilometers west near the old military depot. Thomas nodded slowly. Information, facts, things he could use, things he could transform into action. How many? Thomas, how many? Laurent closed his eyes. 40, maybe 50, they have vehicles, weapons, they're a functioning military unit, and you're— What am I, Laurent? You're one man, a grieving man, and I understand the desire for revenge, but this isn't. Thomas turned and walked away. Laurent called after him, but the words did not penetrate. Nothing penetrated. Thomas was encased in something hard and cold, something that let him move and breathe but did not let him feel. He spent the night in the ruins. He built no fire, he could not bear fire, but sat in the darkness with his back against a wall that still stood, and he thought about what came next. Before the war, he had been a teacher. He had believed in civilization, in culture, in the power of education to elevate humanity. 5 years of war had taught him different lessons. It had taught him that civilization was a thin veneer, that culture could be burned as easily as paper, that humanity was capable of anything when the constraints were removed. The SS had removed all constraints. They had murdered children. They had murdered families. They had burned a village that had no strategic value for no reason except to demonstrate their power, to spread fear, to remind the occupied that resistance had a price. Thomas understood prices, he understood debts, and he understood that some debts could only be paid in blood. As dawn broke over the ruins of Saint-Omer, painting the ash in shades of gray and pink, Thomas Brennan made a decision. He could not bring back his family. He could not undo what had been done. But he could ensure that the men who had done this, who had held the torches, who had given the orders, who had stood by and watched, would understand the cost of their choices. He was going to war, not the war of nations and ideologies, not the war of liberation and occupation, a personal war, a war of one. Thomas spent the first day after his decision walking the ruins methodically, cataloging what remained. He was not looking for valuables, there were none. He was looking for tools. In the collapsed remains of a barn, he found a rusted hunting rifle and a box of ammunition that had survived the fire. The weapon was old, perhaps from the Great War, but functional. He cleaned it with hands that remembered the motions from training, from combat, from the practical education of killing. In a cellar that had escaped the worst of the flames, he found jars of preserved food, bottles of wine, a coil of rope. Ordinary things. Things that could become extraordinary depending on intent. Laurent appeared on the second day, bringing supplies he had gathered from the surrounding area. He watched Thomas work with growing concern. "What are you planning?" Laurent asked. Thomas was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape filling the silence. "I'm planning to make them pay. One man against a company of SS, it's suicide." "Then it's suicide." Thomas tested the knife's edge with his thumb, a thin line of red appeared. "I don't care. Think about what Marie would want, what Sophie would want." Thomas set down the knife carefully. When he looked at Laurent, his eyes were empty in a way that made the other man flinch. "They're dead, Laurent. What they want is irrelevant. What matters is what those men took from them, from me, from everyone in this village. And killing them will bring your family back." "No, but it will make sure they can't do this to someone else's family." Laurent was quiet for a long moment, then he sighed. "You'll need information, patterns, schedules." Thomas looked up. "You'll help." "I'll help you gather intelligence. What you do with it," Laurent shrugged, "that's your choice, your conscience." Over the next week, they learned the rhythms of Vogel's company. The SS unit operated from an old military depot that had been repurposed during the occupation. They sent regular patrols along the roads, maintaining control over the region, reminding the populace of their presence. Thomas watched from the hills. He learned which vehicles they used, which routes they preferred, which times they moved. He was patient. Patience was a soldier's virtue, and whatever else he had not lost that. He began to remember things he had tried to forget. Skills he had learned during his time in combat, during the desperate days of fighting retreat and guerrilla resistance. How to move silently through underbrush. how to read the landscape for positions of advantage, how to think like prey and predator simultaneously. But more than skills, he remembered the mindset, the cold calculus of survival that reduced human beings to targets, obstacles, threats. He had hated that mindset during the war, had felt himself becoming less human each time he accessed it. Now he welcomed it. Now he needed it. The first one died on a Wednesday. Thomas had been watching a patrol, two soldiers who took the same route every other day, inspecting roads and bridges. They moved with the casual confidence of occupiers who had forgotten that war was a two-sided equation. He waited in the trees where the road narrowed between steep banks. When they passed beneath him, he did what needed to be done. It was quick. It was quiet. It was necessary. Afterward, he dragged the bodies into the underbrush and continued walking. He felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no horror, just the empty certainty that this was justice of a kind. The second time was more complex. A small group had taken to searching farmhouses, looking for hidden weapons or evidence of resistance support. Thomas learned their pattern from Lawrence sources. They moved in threes, always covering each other, always alert. He set his trap carefully. A collapsed section of road, a cry for help that drew them into the open, the hunting rifle firing from cover while they scrambled for position. He killed two before they understood what was happening. The third ran and Thomas let him go, let him carry the news, let them know that they were not safe, that someone was hunting them. After each encounter, Thomas returned to the ruins of St. Tomber. He stood in the square where bodies had fallen, in the cottage where his family had died, and he reminded himself why this was necessary, why this was right. But the justifications were becoming harder, not because his resolve was weakening, but because each death took him further from the man he had been, from the teacher who had read poetry to students, from the father who had knelt beside his daughter at the train station and promised they would be together again. That man was dying. Perhaps he was already dead, burned away in the same fire that had taken Marie and Sophie. Laurent found him one evening, sitting on the steps of the ruined church, cleaning the rifle. "They know someone is targeting them," Laurent said. "They're increasing patrols, bringing in reinforcements." "Good, more targets." "Thomas, this can't continue. Eventually they'll find you. Eventually you'll make a mistake." "I don't care." "I know you think that, but when the moment comes, when you're staring down a dozen rifles, you'll discover you do care. The survival instinct doesn't die easily." Thomas looked at him. "Everything I cared about surviving for is already dead. What's left is just momentum." Laurent sat beside him on the steps. They were quiet for a while, two men in the ruins of a world that no longer made sense. "I heard from contacts in the north," Laurent said finally. "The Allies are coming, maybe weeks, maybe days. Liberation is close." "And you think I should wait, should let these men walk away because history is moving in the right direction?" "I think," Laurent paused, choosing his words carefully, "I think there's a difference between justice and revenge, and I think you've crossed that line." "The line was crossed when they burned this village. I'm just acknowledging reality." "Is this what Marie would want?" Thomas stood abruptly, the rifle in his hands. Don't you dare use her to justify letting these men live." "I'm not justifying anything. I'm trying to save what's left of you." "There's nothing left to save." But even as he said it, Thomas wondered if that was true. Because sometimes in the moments between actions, he would catch himself remembering things. The sound of Sophie's laughter, the way Marie would hum while cooking, the smell of chalk dust in his classroom in Lyon, back when the worst problem in his life was convincing teenagers that Baudelaire mattered. Those memories were dangerous. They reminded him that he had been human once, that he could be human again. But humanity was a luxury he could not afford. Not yet, not until the debt was paid. The bridge was old stone, built by Romans or perhaps by people who had forgotten Romans ever existed. It spanned a narrow gorge where a stream cut through limestone, and it was the only route for vehicles moving between the depot and the towns to the east. Thomas had spent 2 days studying it. The structure was solid but not invulnerable. The keystone of the center arch bore the weight of the entire span. Compromise that, and the bridge would fold like a house of cards. He worked at night alone. Laurent had refused to help with this, had called it escalation, as if there were some scale of violence that made sense, some threshold beyond which revenge became unacceptable. Thomas didn't care about thresholds, he cared about outcomes. The explosives were basic, materials he had scavenged and assembled with knowledge from his resistance work. He placed them carefully, knowing that timing would be everything. Too soon and the bridge would collapse empty, a gesture without consequence. Too late and someone might spot the damage before the trap was sprung. He set the charges for remote detonation. Laurent had provided the device reluctantly, perhaps understanding that refusal would not stop Thomas, only make his task more dangerous. Then Thomas climbed the hill above the gorge and waited. The convoy came at dawn, 3 vehicles, a supply truck flanked by 2 smaller transports carrying soldiers. They moved with routine confidence, just another morning patrol in an occupied country that had learned to bow its head. Thomas watched them approach through the scope of the hunting rifle. He could see faces in the trucks. Young men, mostly, wearing uniforms that marked them as enemy, as legitimate targets in a war that had consumed everything. He thought about Sophie, about Marie, about the village full of people who had died for no reason except that they existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. His finger found the detonator. The bridge exploded in a cloud of dust and stone. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder. Thomas watched the center span collapse, watched the lead vehicle, the supply truck, tip forward as the road disappeared beneath it, watched it fall into the gorge in what seemed like slow motion. The sound of the crash came seconds later, metal screaming, glass shattering, and beneath it all sounds he tried not to hear, sounds of human consequences. The other 2 vehicles stopped at the edge of the collapsed bridge. Soldiers poured out, shouting orders, taking defensive positions. They were well trained, responding to ambush protocol even though no ambush came. Thomas had already left. He moved through the forest with practiced silence, putting distance between himself and the attack. Behind him, smoke rose into the morning sky, another marker of destruction in a landscape already scarred by war. He felt nothing. He had stopped feeling after the second kill, or perhaps the third. The emotional mechanism that should have registered satisfaction or horror or anything at all had simply stopped functioning. He was a machine now, processing inputs and generating outputs, moving through a sequence that would end only when the targets were exhausted or he was. Laurent was waiting at their meeting point, a cave in the hills that had once been used by smugglers. He looked at Thomas with something between pity and fear. "I heard the explosion," Laurent said. "The bridge is gone, so is a supply convoy." "How many? Does it matter?" "Yes, Thomas, it matters. Every death matters." Thomas leaned against the cave wall, suddenly exhausted. They were soldiers in a war wearing enemy uniforms. And the line between soldier and murderer is measured in what? Legality, authority, who gives you the right to decide who dies. The same people who gave them the right to burn Saint-Omer. Laurent was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know this will bring retaliation. They'll sweep the entire region. They'll let them come. I'm ready." "But are the people who still live here ready? Because when they come, they won't just look for you. They'll punish anyone they suspect of helping. Any family, any village, anyone who might have looked the other way." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. He hadn't thought about that. Or perhaps he had and had simply pushed it aside, had categorized it as acceptable collateral damage in his personal war. "Then I'll make sure they know it's just me," Thomas said. "I'll make it clear this is personal." "You think they care, you think they differentiate." The question hung in the air between them. Thomas knew the answer. He had seen enough of the occupation to know that the SS made no fine distinctions. Guilt was collective, punishment was communal. One man's resistance became a town's crime. "What do you want me to do?" Thomas asked. "Stop, forgive, forget." "I want you to understand what you're doing, not just to them but to yourself, to everyone around you." "I understand perfectly. I'm making them pay for what they took from me." "And when you're done, when every soldier in that company is dead, when Vogel himself is in the ground, what then? Will Marie and Sophie be any less dead? Will the village be any less burned?" Thomas had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer he couldn't articulate. The revenge wasn't about bringing anyone back. It wasn't even about justice, not really. It was about not stopping. It was about continuing to move forward because stopping meant having to feel everything he had been holding at bay. "I'm going to finish this," Thomas said. Over the following days, Thomas struck 3 more times. Each attack was more calculated, more personal. He was learning their patterns, exploiting their predictable responses. He was becoming what he had been in the early days of the war, a weapon shaped by necessity and pointed at the enemy. But the enemy was also learning. They increased their patrols, traveled in larger groups, varied their routes. Vogel himself, according to Lawrence sources, had become paranoid, surrounding himself with guards, rarely leaving the depot. Thomas began to plan the final assault. The depot was well defended, but no defense was perfect. He spent nights sketching approaches, thinking through scenarios, calculating odds that were heavily stacked against him. Laurent tried one more time to dissuade him. "You'll die," he said simply. "Even if you succeed, you'll die in the attempt." "I know. And that's acceptable to you." Thomas thought about the question. Was death acceptable? In a way, yes. He had been living on borrowed time since the moment he saw the ruins of Saint-Tomber. Every breath since then had been an act of postponement, a temporary stay of execution. "What's unacceptable," Thomas said, "is doing nothing. Marie and Sophie died screaming my name, Laurent. They died hoping I would save them. I wasn't there, I can't undo that. But I can make sure the men who killed them understand what they took." "You're not the only one who's lost people in this war," Laurent said quietly. "Millions have lost everything. What makes your grief more important?" Nothing makes it more important, but it's mine. And this is the only way I know how to carry it." The night before his planned assault on the depot, Thomas returned to Saint-Tomber one last time. He stood in the square where the fountain still dripped ash-dark water. He walked to the cottage with blue shutters that were no longer blue, no longer shutters, just charred memory. He had buried Marie and Sophie in the garden behind the cottage. No ceremony, no prayers, he had no faith left for prayers. Just two bodies wrapped in blankets he had found in the ruins, laid to rest in the earth they had briefly called home. He knelt at the graves now, his hand on the disturbed soil. "I'm finishing it," he said to the silent earth. "Tomorrow, one way or another, it ends tomorrow." The night was quiet except for the wind in the ruins. Thomas stayed until dawn, talking sometimes, silent mostly, saying goodbye to a life that had ended when the fire began. The depot sat on the outskirts of a town that had been evacuated months ago, buildings empty, streets silent, as if the war had already moved on and left only ghosts. The compound itself was functional rather than elegant. Concrete walls, guard towers, a central building that had once been a factory, now converted to barracks and command center. Thomas observed for 2 days before moving. He catalogued routines, counted guards, identified vulnerabilities. His planning was meticulous because it had to be. There would be no second chance. He entered the compound at night during the changing of the guard, a 3-minute window when attention was divided. The wall was 12 feet high, but he had learned to climb during his time in the resistance. His hands found purchase in gaps between stones, and he pulled himself up and over in silence. Inside, he moved like a shadow. The compound was quieter at night, most of the soldiers either sleeping or gathered in the mess hall. Thomas had learned the layout from Lawrence sources, where Vogel's quarters were, where the armory was located, where the sentries walked their routes. He bypassed the first 2 sentries using nothing but patience and timing. Violence was inefficient. Every confrontation increased the chance of alarm. Instead, he ghosted through shadows, a phantom in a world of the inattentive. The armory was secured but not impenetrable. Thomas had brought tools, simple picks that worked the lock in under a minute. Inside, he found what he needed: grenades, ammunition, and a flamethrower mounted on the wall like a trophy. He stared at the flamethrower for a long moment, the weapon that had been used on his village, on his family. Fire had been the SS's choice of punishment, reducing lives and histories to ash and memory. Thomas lifted the flamethrower from its mount. It was heavy, awkward, a weapon designed to inspire terror rather than respect. He checked its tank still half full. Enough. The sounds of alarm came sooner than he expected. Someone had discovered the missing sentry he had been forced to silence near the armory. Shouts echoed through the compound, lights blazed to life, boots pounded on concrete. Thomas abandoned stealth. He walked into the center of the compound, the flamethrower in his hands, and when the first soldiers appeared from the barracks, he pulled the trigger. Fire erupted like judgment. It painted the night in oranges and reds, it screamed across the distance, it consumed everything it touched. Soldiers fell back, shouting, some ablaze, all terrified. Thomas advanced. He was not thinking anymore, he was not calculating. He was a vessel for something primal and terrible, and the fire was his voice. More soldiers appeared, rifles fired. Thomas felt impact once, twice, his body registering damage with detached surprise, but pain was distant. He kept moving, kept firing, kept burning. A grenade landed near his feet. He kicked it away and it exploded against a wall, showering him with concrete dust. The central building loomed ahead. Vogel would be there, the man who had given the orders, the man who had sentenced an entire village to death for the crime of existence. Thomas forced his way inside, the flamethrower sweeping corridors clear. The building was chaos, soldiers scrambling, officers shouting orders, the whole structure coming apart under the assault of a single vengeful man who had stopped caring about survival. He found Vogel on the second floor, in what had been an office. The captain was in his uniform, sidearm drawn, backed against a wall as Thomas entered. "You," Vogel said in accented French. His face was pale but composed. "The ghost from Saint-Omer." Thomas said nothing. The flamethrower was heavy in his hands. He could feel blood soaking through his clothes from at least 2 bullet wounds. His vision was narrowing at the edges. "You think this is justice," Vogel continued. "You think murdering soldiers makes you righteous." "I think," Thomas said slowly, his voice hoarse, "that you burned my family alive. I think you killed a village full of innocent people. I think you're going to understand what that feels like." "They were harboring terrorists. There are rules." "There are no rules," Thomas interrupted. "Not anymore, not after what you did." Vogel's hand twitched toward his pistol. Thomas saw the movement, raised the flamethrower slightly. "Don't," he said. But Vogel moved anyway. Perhaps he was brave. Perhaps he was foolish. Perhaps he simply couldn't accept that this was how his story ended, not in glorious battle, but in a factory office facing a wounded man with a weapon of terror. The gun cleared its holster. Thomas pulled the trigger. Fire filled the room. Vogel screamed, a sound Thomas would hear in whatever came after death. A sound that should have brought satisfaction but brought only emptiness. When the fuel ran out, Thomas dropped the flamethrower. His legs gave out and he fell to his knees. The office was an inferno. Smoke choked the air. He could hear soldiers coming up the stairs, could hear orders being shouted. He thought about Marie, about Sophie, about whether they would understand what he had done, whether they would forgive him for becoming this. He thought about the teacher he had been, reading poetry to students who didn't care, believing in civilization and progress and the perfectibility of humankind. He thought about how far he had fallen and how little it mattered. The soldiers burst into the room, rifles raised. They shouted at him to surrender, to put his hands up, to comply with orders that seemed to come from very far away. Thomas looked at them through the smoke. Young men, most of them, somebody's sons, somebody's brothers, just like he had been once. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply knelt there, blighting, burning, waiting for the end. The rifles fired. The war ended 3 weeks later. Allied forces swept through the region, liberation arriving like spring after terrible winter. The German occupation collapsed, officers arrested, soldiers surrendered, and the machinery of evil ground to a halt. Laurent stood in the ruins of Saint-Omer, looking at graves that would never be marked on official records. The village was being written into history as a casualty of occupation, one of hundreds of such tragedies, each one a story of loss that exceeded the capacity of statistics to measure. He had buried Thomas near Marie and Sophie. It seemed right. A family reunited in death, if nowhere else. The depot had burned for 2 days after Thomas's assault. 16 soldiers dead, 20 more injured. And Thomas himself, who had somehow survived long enough to be pulled from the flames before dying of his wounds in a field hospital. Laurent had heard the story from a nurse who had been there. Thomas had spoken no final words, offered no wisdom, simply closed his eyes and stopped. News of the liberation spread. People emerged from hiding, resistance fighters revealed themselves, collaborators were arrested, and the work of rebuilding began. France would rise again. The war would be remembered and discussed and analyzed. Heroes would be celebrated, villains condemned, and the complex truth of occupation would be simplified into narratives that made sense. But standing in Saint-Omer, Laurent wondered what sense any of it made. Thomas had got his revenge. He had killed the men who killed his family. He had made them pay. And what had it accomplished? Marie and Sophie were still dead. The village was still destroyed. Thomas had transformed his grief into violence and his violence into death, and the equation balanced to zero. Laurent thought about the last conversation they had, about justice versus revenge, about whether Thomas's crusade had been righteous or simply destructive. He had no answer. Perhaps there was no answer. Perhaps in times of war, when everything was reduced to survival and vengeance, such questions became meaningless. A young woman approached, picking her way through the ruins. She introduced herself as a journalist, documenting the atrocities of occupation. She had heard about Saint-Omer, wanted to include it in her report. "Can you tell me what happened here?" she asked, notebook in hand. Laurent looked at the ruins, at the fountain still choked with ash, at the blackened stones that had once been homes and shops and the ordinary architecture of living. "The SS burned it," he said. "Reprisal for resistance activity, everyone died." Everyone's. Almost everyone's. Were there any survivors who sought justice? Anyone who? Justice? Laurent felt something bitter rise in his throat. There's no justice in war, only victims, some wearing uniforms, some not, all dead in the end. The journalist wrote this down, though Laurent suspected she would edit it later, make it more palatable, more fitting to whatever narrative she was constructing. After she left, Laurent sat on the steps of the ruined church, the same steps where he had last spoken with Thomas, and watched the sun set over the devastation. In the distance, he could hear celebration. People in the nearby towns rejoicing at liberation, at the end of occupation, at the promise of peace. But here in Saint-Omer there was only silence. Laurent thought about Thomas's face as he had cleaned his rifle, expression empty of everything except determination. He thought about the man Thomas had been before the war, a teacher, a father, a husband, and the thing he had become after loss stripped away those identities. Was Thomas a hero, a murderer, a victim who became a perpetrator? Laurent had no easy answer. Thomas had loved deeply, had suffered enormously, and had responded to that suffering with violence that achieved nothing except more death. Perhaps that was the only lesson. That revenge was a circle without exit, that violence bred violence, that war destroyed everyone it touched regardless of which side they fought for or whether they fought at all. As darkness fell over Saint-Omer, Laurent stood and walked away from the ruins. Behind him, the graves of Marie, Sophie, and Thomas lay in the earth, unmarked and unmourned except by one man who had watched a friend disappear into grief and never return. The war was over, liberation had come, France would rebuild. But in Saint-Omer, nothing would ever grow again.